I am Eleanor. I am 75 years old, and until recently, the sound of my life was just the ticking of the clock in my foyer. That clock had been ticking for 50 years in this house, measuring out the seconds of my marriage to Arthur, the minutes I spent raising my son, Daniel, and the decades I dedicated to being the quiet backbone of this family. I always believed a simple truth, a thesis I lived by. A mother's duty is to pay for her children's happiness, no matter the cost. I'd paid for everything. Daniel's college tuition, his failed business ventures, and even the lavish engagement ring he gave to his fiancée, Melissa. I believed that if I kept their world soft enough, they would never want to leave me, and they would never know the pain Arthur and I endured building this fortune. The trouble started, as it often does, not with a bang, but with a measurement. If you're still here, welcome to Voice of Jenna, a place where stories aren't just told, they're felt. Here, we dive into real emotions, family drama, quiet heartbreaks, unexpected twists, and the moments that change us. So sit back, relax, and let me tell you what happened next. It was 3 years after Arthur passed. The house, this historic Victorian mansion worth over $15 million, had settled into a heavy quiet. Daniel and Melissa arrived one Tuesday unannounced. They didn't come to share their joy over the engagement. They came to demand the venue. Melissa, a woman who radiated polished, professional, and very smooth, laid out her plans on my antique mahogany dining table, treating the precious wood like a blueprint. She was demanding the location for the wedding, my home. She spoke of a fairy tale, wedding on the property, and then, with terrifying casualness, she informed me that she wanted me to host her, Daniel, and her 25 relatives for Christmas. She didn't ask if I was ready. She started measuring the parlor for new draperies. I remember the sound of the measuring tape snapping back into its case, a sharp, aggressive sound of ownership. She looked at the expansive space, then at me, and said, "It's the best choice, Mom. You don't need all this space at this age." That was the first fracture in my thesis. She wasn't asking for a blessing. She was demanding a deposit on my life. The implication was a sharp knife twist. I was too old to own the space they needed for their grand life. The wedding wasn't just a party. It was the final setup for them to move me out and seize the house. I am ashamed to say I agreed to it. I was the enabler. My default was always yes. The preparations began immediately, and Melissa moved in. She didn't bring just boxes. She brought entitlement. She treated me like a silent ghost, constantly talking about me in the third person to the decorators and planners. My house was simply a free event venue, an inconvenient but necessary backdrop. The core of their desire was Arthur's will. It was complex, written to protect me. It stipulated that the deed to the beautiful, historic villa property would only be handed over to Daniel 1 month after the wedding. The delay was Arthur's final safety measure, designed to give me time to pull the plug if things went sour. One afternoon, I made the mistake of mentioning that Arthur and I had planted the rose bushes she wanted to remove. Melissa looked at me with open pity. "Eleanor, darling, it's going to be my house soon. We need a clean slate." I retreated to the kitchen, the one room in the house that had always been mine. I started crying quietly into a damp dish rag. The betrayal was like a physical ache in my chest. That's when Sophia, the caterer, found me. Sophia was a recent immigrant, a sharp, hard-working woman who owned her own small business. She had been hired because her food was excellent, but Melissa treated her like a servant, barking orders and demanding ridiculous, last-minute changes. Sophia didn't offer pity. She offered me strong, black coffee and told me her story, the endless hours she worked, the sacrifices she made to build something real for her own family. I saw myself in her, the woman Arthur fell in love with, the builder. And then I saw my children through her eyes. They were simply consumers. That night, the clock in the foyer didn't just tick, it hammered out a warning. I couldn't sleep. I was just trying to get a glass of water at 3 a.m. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that hides an argument. I crept down the back stairs, pretending to be a frail, sleeping woman. I heard Melissa and Daniel talking in hushed, furious whispers near Arthur's old study. Melissa was raging about the will. "We have to go through with the wedding, Daniel," she hissed. "We need the house in our name before she gets any funny ideas. She's getting forgetful. We can push the competency papers through next month." Then came the dagger. "The trust is structured so stupidly. Your mother is sitting on a staggering $30 million liquid estate. We need to seize control of it immediately. This wedding isn't about us. It's about the deadline." I stood there, invisible. They weren't asking for a blessing. They were demanding the contents of my coffin. I was an elderly woman, facing a fight against a trust that wants to piece and control my life. I realized that the wedding wasn't just a threat to my home. It was a deadline for my institutionalization. My son was complicit. The wound of betrayal was complete. I went back upstairs, my glass of water forgotten. The woman they expected to bury was very much awake. I heard the low hum of Daniel's voice say, "If she causes any trouble, we tell the judge she's been misled by a suspicious associate. We lock her out of the accounts before Monday morning. It's all riding on this." I backed away, realizing they were already drafting the legal papers to have me declared incompetent. The next morning, I was no longer the enabler. I was the strategist. My new reality was this. I did not lose my children. I found the woman they expected me to bury. I called Robert Vaughn immediately, Arthur's old lawyer. He was immediately skeptical. I didn't cry or panic. I relayed the whispers, the staggering $30 million, and their concrete plan to institutionalize me. "Eleanor, if you sign the marriage gift papers, the house is legally gone and the trust is split," Robert said, his voice flat with professional alarm. "They are moving fast to file the papers before you can get the codicil filed. We have to use the wedding against them. We need a secret operation, and you have to eliminate the incentive." I hung up, the words "eliminate the incentive" echoing in the quiet foyer. My counterthesis was forming, hardening in the silence of the abandoned wedding preparations. A mother's duty is to teach her children that entitlement has consequences. I spent the next 2 days working only through secured lines. Robert and I began the financial audit. We discovered Daniel had already illegally used my money to fund his wife's lavish wedding preparations, routing funds through a shell company to pay the deposit on the event coordinator. We had the elder abuse leverage, and Robert moved to secure the elder law attorney who had just won a landmark case against a brother who stole from his mother's medical fund. My protective purpose was now crystal clear. I was going to use the wedding as a trap to secure the house and expose their financial fraud. The preparations continued around me, but they were no longer a source of dread. They were a source of data. The microaggressions became my focus points. The first offense came when Melissa and Daniel were selecting the floral arrangements. I suggested my favorite flower, the white peony, a symbol of my marriage to Arthur. Melissa smiled, a brittle, forced smile that didn't reach her eyes, and told the florist, "Oh, absolutely not. Peonies are unflattering for a mother of the groom. They look too old. We need something more modern, more vibrant." I knew I was being erased aesthetically from the event and the space. I was simply a fixture that needed to be painted over. The second offense was structural. I caught Daniel in Arthur's study, where I kept my personal safe. He was not looking at the safe. He was on the phone, talking to a moving company. I heard him say, "No, she won't need a four-poster. Just a simple twin bed. And yes, make sure it's in the memory care wing. We'll be moving her immediately after the reception." He was arranging my final furniture delivery to Serenity Meadows before the invitations were even printed. The betrayal was no longer speculative. It was a logistics issue for them. The third offense was the most personal. Melissa decided to hang a colossal portrait of herself and Daniel in the foyer, directly covering the framed photograph of Arthur and me on our wedding day. She informed me that the old photo was dated and detracted from the modern aesthetic. It was a direct, visual assertion that my marriage, my history, and my love were inconvenient clutter. These incidents didn't break me. They fueled the fire of my resolve. While Melissa was busy with seating charts, I focused on my greatest leverage, the house deed. I looked around the kitchen, and my gaze landed on Sophia, the caterer. She was calm, focused and meticulous, working 18 hours a day to build her business. I saw in her the exact opposite of my own children, the honest vessel of the legacy I truly valued: hard work, honor, and sacrifice. I called Robert Vaughn immediately. "We're not giving the house to a charity, Robert. I've found the new heir." Robert was stunned, but I was resolved. "The will needs to be changed. The house is going to Sophia, the caterer. I want the final, complex papers for the caterer's trust drafted immediately." The house was a battleground, and I was setting the ultimate trap. I had the deed drafted and the will codicil signed. Robert Vaughn, bless his skeptical heart, had pulled off a miracle, finalizing the paperwork for the caterer's trust under a veil of legal secrecy so thick Melissa couldn't penetrate it even if she tried. But the calm was temporary. The enemy was already inside the gate. The shocking act arrived on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks before the wedding. I was in the kitchen with Sophia, reviewing the menus, a simple, grounding task that brought me a strange sense of peace. Sophia was showing me the sketch of the magnificent, multi-tiered wedding cake she was designing. She had used a delicate sugar bloom resembling the white peonies that Melissa had banned from the actual flower arrangements, a private, gentle act of kindness. Just then, the front door burst open. It wasn't just Daniel and Melissa. It was a small army, a nervous-looking photographer, a videographer, and a pair of professional models dressed as a bride and groom. Melissa was incandescent with rage and entitlement. She stopped dead in the foyer, her eyes zeroing in on the kitchen, and she didn't just speak. She delivered an ultimatum that cut me to my core. "Mom, what in God's name is this mess?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at the remnants of my private life, my sewing basket, the mail, the quiet debris of an elderly woman's afternoon. "This is simply unacceptable. We are shooting the official wedding invitations today, and the house is supposed to be perfect. You have been told 100 times not to leave your personal clutter in the common areas." Then she turned to the models and the crew, throwing her hands up in manufactured distress. "I am so sorry, everyone. My mother is having one of her days. We will have to shoot around the unsightly bits." But the real knife twist was reserved for me. She walked right up to Sophia, who was gently wiping down a counter, and snatched the beautiful, delicate cake sketch right out of her hands. "And you, Sophia," Melissa spat, ripping the paper in half. "This is atrocious. It's not a wedding cake. It's a birthday cake for a grandmother. Your creativity is clearly not up to the level required here. We will be using the French pâtisserie." She turned to Daniel. "Cancel her contract. Immediately." Daniel, in his expensive blazer and press slacks, didn't intervene. He didn't even look at me. He just shifted his weight uncomfortably and murmured to Melissa, "Darling, maybe we should just use the living room for the shoot. The lighting is better." He was complicit. He stood there, silent and solid, choosing his fiancé's toxic aggression over his mother's dignity. I felt a dizzying wave of family paralysis. Sophia was stunned, the ripped sketch fluttering to the floor. The crew nervously set up their lighting, pretending not to hear the domestic explosion. The owner of the house, the woman paying for the entire spectacle, was reduced to a piece of furniture that was blocking the shot. But the most shocking act was the theft that followed. Melissa didn't just leave. As she walked toward the stairs, she casually reached into the small, antique Chinese bowl on the hall table, a bowl Arthur and I had picked up on our honeymoon, and swept the contents into her handbag. The contents were not money. They were the tiny, polished, commemorative silver coins that Arthur had given me every Christmas. Small, sentimental pieces that meant nothing to her, but everything to me. She looked at me and delivered the toxic justification, the core of their moral bankruptcy. "What? They're lovely. Besides, Mom, we need this, darling. The wedding budget has been so tight. You know the old saying, the only thing that matters is legacy. And your legacy is us, so this is just borrowing from our future." The words hung in the air. The only thing that matters is legacy. To them, legacy wasn't character or contribution. It was simply the monetary value of my house and the liquid assets. I was not the author of my legacy. I was just the unfortunate obstacles standing in front of it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. I watched her pose for the camera, kissing Daniel under the framed spot where Arthur and I used to smile, her handbag heavy with my stolen sentiment. I walked straight to Sophia, who was picking up the torn pieces of the cake sketch. I gently put my hand on her arm. "Sophia," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Don't worry about the contract. It's cancelled. But yours is not the French pâtisserie's food I want served at the reception." She looked at me, confused. "I want you to be the caterer," I repeated, my eyes boring into hers. "And I want you to know that the house you are catering in is about to become yours." The shock on her face was immediate. She didn't understand, but she nodded. The pain of the betrayal had been the necessary fire to burn away my passivity. The toxicity of their thesis, that only money matters, had galvanized my antithesis. A mother's duty is to teach her children that entitlement has consequences. I knew their final move would be swift. I knew Daniel was arranging my final delivery to the memory care wing. It was time to pull the trigger on the legal counterattack. The wedding date was set. The stage for their humiliation was almost complete. I went to my secure laptop and finished the final documents that would transfer the estate's primary liquid assets, the $30 million they craved, into the untraceable foundation. I had to move faster than they could file the competency papers. The battle was no longer over love. It was a race against the clock to secure the money and the deed before the clock struck midnight on their dream. The immediate aftermath of the floral fiasco and the theft of Arthur's sentimental coins was a cold, decisive retreat into strategic silence. I knew I couldn't confront them directly. Their legal threat was real, and my panic would only feed their narrative that I was losing my grip. I needed to solidify the break from my past role as the weeping mother and transition fully into the role of the silent protector. I stopped intervening in the wedding plans altogether. When Melissa asked for my opinion on the seating arrangement, a question I knew was purely rhetorical, I simply said, "Robert Vaughn is handling all estate matters. Please refer all financial and logistical questions to his office." This was my first official act of abdication from my role as the enabler, and it had the desired effect. It unnerved them. The contact came that evening, not from Daniel, but from Melissa. She was the one who was truly desperate. She was the one who had staked her entire social reputation on this wedding and, more importantly, on the transfer of the house deed. My phone rang incessantly. When I finally answered, her voice was strained, high-pitched, and laced with that false sweetness she used when she was trying to manipulate.
"Mom.
Where are you? Daniel said you're not answering his calls. The cake vendor needs final sign-off, and the electrician is asking about the power grid for the outdoor lights. You are deliberately making this difficult." I let her ramble, listening to the frantic unraveling of her control. "I am simply following the legal advice of my counsel," I stated calmly. "You are aware that the house is a primary asset in an ongoing estate dispute. All communications regarding its use must go through Mr. Vaughn." Her voice hardened instantly, the sugary facade dissolving into spite. "Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor. This is my wedding. You are threatening to destroy Daniel's credibility. People already think you're eccentric for living alone in that mausoleum. If you pull this now, after all the invitations are out, everyone will know you've lost your mind. We will tell them you are suffering from acute paranoia and delusion fueled by that mercenary lawyer. We will destroy your reputation and prove you are unfit to manage your own affairs. Just come back, sign the final vendor checks, and we can forget this foolishness." She was threatening to destroy my credibility, the only weapon I had left against the competency papers. She was attempting to force me back into the lie, where I was just the generous, dotty old woman whose generosity they could exploit. But the threat only reinforced my decision. "My arrangements are final, Melissa. Any attempt to contact me outside of legal channels will be interpreted as harassment and added to the file. You may proceed with the wedding as planned, but you must adhere to the terms of the temporary tenancy agreement I have initiated with the estate." I hung up before she could formulate a response, the sound of her frustrated shriek still audible through the phone line. I was no longer in their world. I was safely behind my legal fortress, using their own obsession, the wedding, as the catalyst for my escape. I focused on the one thing that truly mattered now, securing the deed transfer to Sophia. My commitment to the truth was solidified. I would not return to the lie for the sake of their reputation. The cost was high, but the freedom was absolute. I knew I was moving faster than the law. I was moving faster than their greed. My immediate, decisive retreat had unnerved Melissa, but I knew the threat to destroy my credibility was not a bluff. She was already setting the stage for the competency hearing, painting me as a delusional eccentric misled by a predatory lawyer. To win, I couldn't rely on emotional testimony. I needed cold, objective, verifiable fact. I needed an audit. I consulted the two professional validators in my life, Robert Vaughn, my lawyer, and Margaret Chen, Arthur's longtime, discreet personal accountant. My meeting with Robert was brisk. He was focused on the legal trap, the deed transfer to Sophia, the restraining order, and the countersuit for elder financial abuse. But it was Margaret who truly grounded my perspective in fact and logic. Margaret was a stern, brilliant woman in her late 60s who had managed Arthur's private accounts for decades. She looked at the initial audit requests, her expression unchanging, and simply said, "We need a clinical log, Eleanor. Not a memory. Every transaction must be tracked, not by what it bought, but by what it served." For the next 4 days, I compiled the audit. It was a detailed clinical log of all the past costs and manipulations, going back 5 years, categorized by the toxic thesis that had governed my life. A mother's duty is to pay for her children's happiness, no matter the cost. I started with Daniel. Category 1. Bailouts for business failure, the cost of incompetence. Transaction 1. $125,000 wire transfer for Daniel's failed app startup. Purpose: to prevent him from facing bankruptcy and having to seek a real job. Transaction 2. $40,000 for consulting fees to his friend's company, which I later discovered was just to cover the lease on his luxury car. Purpose: to maintain the appearance of financial success. Transaction 3. $50,000 paid to his ex-landlord to prevent an eviction notice that would have ruined his credit. Purpose: to shield him from the natural consequences of debt. Category 2. The cost of sentiment, Melissa's manipulations. Transaction 1. $15,000 for a designer kitchen remodel in Daniel's condo, which Melissa demanded before agreeing to move in. Purpose: to buy my way into Melissa's approval. Transaction 2. The $4,000 cost of the mother of the groom designer gown that Melissa claimed was unflattering, ensuring I had no appropriate outfit for the wedding I was paying for. Purpose: to assert dominance and control over my presence. Transaction 3. The ongoing, undocumented use of my credit card for wedding planning supplies, which included thousands spent on jewelry and trips for Melissa's relatives. Purpose: to maintain peace and avoid a scene. Category 3. The cost of the house, the price of ownership. Transaction 1. $80,000 paid annually for property taxes and maintenance on the historic villa that Daniel fully expected to inherit. Purpose: to maintain his future asset at my expense. Transaction 2. The cost of the entire lavish wedding budget, which was fraudulently withdrawn from my personal savings using Daniel's access codes. Total: $350,000 and climbing. Purpose: the direct price of the legal ambush. The total of this clinical log was staggering. Over the past 5 years, I had poured nearly $900,000 into shielding Daniel and Melissa from the reality of their own incompetence and greed. The cost of their wedding alone was almost $500,000, the very wedding that was designed to facilitate my institutionalization. The audit transformed my perspective. It was no longer a personal feud. It was a matter of corporate fraud and strategic defense. I felt no remorse, only a cold, crystalline resolve. My memory was not failing. My records were meticulous. The audit was the hard evidence that proved I was not delusional, but rather a victim of a calculated, prolonged scheme of financial exploitation. I presented the audit to Robert Vaughn. He looked over the spreadsheet, noting the meticulous detail. "This," he said, tapping the total sum, "is the proof we need." This is the financial exploitation that justifies the temporary restraining order and the countersuit. We don't need to argue about your mental state, Eleanor. We just need to argue about the money they stole to pay for the house they want to take. With the audit complete, I had solidified the legal foundations of my escape. My next step was the final, non-negotiable insurance policy Arthur had left me, the tiny key to the $42 million Manhattan Trust. I had to retrieve it before the chaos of the wedding preparations made it impossible. The wedding was 2 days away. My time as the enabler was officially over. The audit was complete, giving me the clinical evidence of their financial exploitation. The deed to Sophia was drafted, ensuring the house was protected. The restraining order was waiting on Robert's desk. But as I mentally checked off my defense strategy, a gnawing anxiety persisted. I hadn't yet secured the ultimate failsafe, the tiny key to the $42 million Manhattan Trust. I had to get it out of the house, out of the safe, before Daniel and Melissa's access became absolute. I went up to Arthur's study, the room they had largely ignored, focusing only on the parlor and the dining room for their party. The safe was behind a massive, framed portrait of Arthur. The combination was easy, our anniversary, a date Daniel had forgotten 3 years in a row. I opened the heavy door and found the dusty envelope. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that this small key was the only thing that stood between me and complete ruin. I slipped the key into the inner pocket of my silk dressing gown. As I was about to close the safe, my fingers brushed against a thin sheaf of papers tucked into a separate, zippered canvas pocket at the very back. These weren't bonds or cash. They were legal documents, yellowed and crisp with age. I pulled them out. The top document was titled, Absolute Irrevocable Financial Power of Attorney. My signature was on it, dated 3 years ago, 6 months after Arthur's funeral. My mind raced. Arthur had been meticulous. He would never have asked me to sign something like this without explanation. I read the document, the dense legal jargon clouding my breath. It stated that, in my time of grief, I had voluntarily transferred all control over liquid investments and the management of all non-trust bank accounts, including my private savings, the funds I had been using for the audit, to Daniel, citing his superior understanding of market dynamics and long-term investment strategy. The date, 6 months after Arthur's death, was when Daniel had been particularly solicitous, coming by every day, bringing flowers, and talking endlessly about how much he wanted to help ease my burden. I remembered signing a stack of documents he claimed were simply insurance claim forms and updated safety deposit box access papers. I hadn't read them. I had trusted my son. The blood drained from my face. This wasn't just a document. It was the ultimate legal betrayal. The power of attorney was absolute and irrevocable unless revoked in writing by a court order proving fraud, a long, agonizing process they would use to argue I was already incompetent. The question hammered in my skull, how much control have I already surrendered? I realized my frantic audit, the meticulous tracking of the $900,000, had been tracking money Daniel already legally controlled. The funds I had been using to pay Robert Vaughn and fund the initial transfer into the new foundation were technically still under Daniel's ultimate legal purview. If he discovered the transfer of the house deed, he wouldn't need to wait for the competency hearing. He could use the irrevocable power of attorney to immediately freeze all my personal accounts, including the escrow account I had established to pay Sophia and Robert, arguing I was recklessly depleting assets under his management. He could choke off my legal defense instantly. I was exposed. My entire strategy, the restraining order, the countersuit for elder abuse, was predicated on my ability to fund the fight. But Daniel already held the financial leash. I looked at the tiny key in my pocket, the key to the $42 million Manhattan Trust. It was untouched by the power of attorney because Arthur, in his wisdom, had separated that trust entirely and made it contingent upon a physical key, not a signature. It was the only asset that was absolutely mine. I realized Daniel must not know about that key. He must believe the irrevocable power of attorney gave him control over everything. But this new, complex legal obstacle demanded immediate action. I had to use the one leverage he didn't know I had. I needed to move fast before he activated the power of attorney and froze my life savings entirely. I locked the safe, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the key in my pocket. I had to tell Robert Vaughn about the power of attorney immediately, but I couldn't risk a phone call. I knew they were listening. I found a small, heavy piece of marble on Arthur's desk, a souvenir from a trip we had taken. I carefully wrapped the irrevocable power of attorney document around it and tied it tightly with twine. I opened the window, looked out at the thick, protective hedge bordering the property, and then, with a strength I didn't know I possessed, I hurled the weighted document into the dense foliage, hoping Robert would know where to look. I couldn't risk having the document in the house if they came for me. My fate now rested on Robert finding that small, desperate parcel before the wedding bells rang. The legal battle had just become intensely personal and deeply complex. The wedding was exactly 48 hours away, and the house was a controlled chaos of vendors and florists. I had tossed the irrevocable power of attorney document out the window, hoping Robert Vaughn would understand the signal, but the thought of Daniel holding that legal leash kept me locked in a state of high alert. My anxiety wasn't for the $42 million. That was safe, but for the temporary accounts I needed to pay my current legal bills and to finalize the deed transfer to Sophia. If Daniel activated the POA now, the escrow would freeze, and the entire countersuit would collapse. I was in the kitchen, making a cup of tea, when the physical confrontation began. I heard the muffled sound of voices arguing fiercely near the back entrance. The door I had been leaving ajar, hoping Robert would retrieve the document. The door burst open, and it wasn't a vendor. It was Daniel and Melissa, their faces distorted with a mixture of panic and righteous fury. They had found the parcel. "Where is it, Mom?" Daniel demanded, his voice tight with menace. He had never used that tone with me, not even when I refused to pay off his gambling debts. He was holding the crumpled, soiled power of attorney document, his index finger jabbing at my signature. "What did you think you were doing, throwing this outside like trash? Robert Vaughn has been sniffing around the hedges for the last hour. This document is legal. It gives me control of your affairs. You are violating the terms of our agreement." Melissa swept into the room, her eyes darting around my kitchen, my sanctuary, with a predatory focus. "We checked your bank accounts, Eleanor," she announced, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "There's an escrow account opened 2 days ago with a transfer of nearly $250,000. What did you buy, Mom? Did you buy some ridiculous yacht? Because that money is legally Daniel's to manage under this power of attorney. We are freezing it now unless you sign the final wedding gift papers." The invasion was complete. They had violated the sanctity of my home, using coercion and the threat of financial strangulation. They believed they had me cornered. They believed the power of attorney was the ultimate weapon to force me back into compliance. I put down my teacup, deliberately slowing my movements. My hand went into the inner pocket of my dressing gown, and my fingers closed around the tiny, cool metal of the Manhattan Trust key. The antithesis line provided the shield I needed. A mother's duty is to teach her children that entitlement has consequences. "You are correct, Daniel," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through their rising hysteria. "That power of attorney gives you legal access to my liquid savings and investment accounts, which is precisely why I moved the only money that mattered years ago." I fixed my gaze on Melissa, who was already reaching for her phone to call the bank. "You're threatening to freeze the escrow account? Go ahead. Freeze it. You're simply proving my point in court, that you are using an irrevocable power of attorney, which you coerced me into signing while I was grieving, to financially exploit me." Daniel hesitated. He hadn't expected the defiance, nor the legal accuracy. "Coerced? Mom, we were helping you. You are not thinking clearly." "I am thinking perfectly clearly," I countered, leaning against the counter. "You are correct that the power of attorney is a trap. But there is a greater trap you failed to account for." I walked over to the desk near the window, a small, ornamental desk where I paid my bills. I deliberately picked up a glossy, printed brochure that I had left there, a brochure for a luxury, all-inclusive cruise package to the Mediterranean. It had a price tag of $25,000 circled in red ink. That $250,000 you see in escrow is not gone, I continued, meeting Melissa's greedy gaze. It is the down payment for Sophia, the caterer's new business loan. And the cruise you see here? That is a thank you gift for Robert Vaughn. Melissa scoffed. You gave your life savings to your caterer and your lawyer? No, I corrected, my voice hardening. I paid for my freedom. And since you have illegally used funds under the pretext of wedding planning to pay for a party that will now serve as evidence in my elder abuse case, I have already counterfiled. The power of attorney you hold is worthless in the face of the temporary restraining order Robert Vaughn filed an hour ago. It cites financial exploitation and immediately bans you and Melissa from the property effective immediately. I defended my space using my new legal threat. I walked to the refrigerator and calmly pulled off the small, decorative magnet holding a printed notice. It was a copy of the TRO. You have 10 minutes to collect your personal effects and leave the house, I stated, holding the notice out. If you are on the property when the clock strikes 5 p.m., Robert Vaughn will contact the sheriff. You will be arrested for violating a court order. The paper, printed with the bold, official stamp of the court, hit them harder than any physical force. They realized their power of attorney, their ultimate weapon, was just one piece of paper against my entire, carefully constructed legal fortress. They looked at the beautiful house, their coveted sanctuary, and realized that not only was it not theirs, they couldn't even stand on the porch without facing arrest. They scrambled, not for their mother, but for their forgotten boxes of expensive wedding decor. The climactic invasion had failed. The confrontation was over. Daniel and Melissa, defeated by the temporary restraining order, had fled the house, their faces a mix of humiliation and pure, unadulterated panic. The wedding was ruined. My house was safe. The escrow account was, for the moment, protected by the countersuit. I had defended my space using my new legal threat, and the climactic invasion had failed. I stood in the parlor, amidst the wreckage of abandoned tool and half-eaten gourmet appetizers, and delivered my final, definitive statement to the empty room. It was my antithesis line, the rejection of the toxic value that had governed my life for decades. You speak of legacy, Melissa, I whispered, looking at the spot where the commissioned portrait of them had briefly covered my life with Arthur. You define legacy as the monetary value of a deed. You think the only thing that matters is the 30 million you couldn't seize. You are wrong. I raised my voice, speaking for the first time with the full, unwavering force of my 75 years. The only thing that matters is not the legacy you inherit, but the character you refuse to build. I did not lose my children. I saved myself and my house from the thieves I raised. It was my moment of triumph, the absolute height of my self-liberation. I was done. I had won. But victory, as I learned immediately, is always conditional. I walked to Arthur's study, intending to call Robert Vaughn and confirm the transfer of the deed to Sophia. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, a small, white envelope resting on the carpet just inside the threshold. It had been slipped under the door after Daniel and Melissa had fled, likely by Daniel in one last, desperate act of spite. I picked up the envelope. It was thin, cheap paper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. The document inside wasn't a bank freezing notice or a subpoena. It was a petition for emergency competency guardianship. The date was stamped 3 days ago. The petitioners were Daniel and Melissa. The document detailed a staggering list of my supposed failings: acute delusional behavior, reckless endangerment of family assets, and suspected onset of senile dementia, evidenced by erratic behavior and the deliberate destruction of key financial documents. The destruction they were referring to was the power of attorney document I had thrown out the window. They had already filed the paperwork. The ultimate threat had been delivered. The guardianship petition meant that the battle was no longer about the house or the money. It was about my mind, my autonomy, and my very identity. It was existential. If the court approved this petition, Daniel would gain full, legal control over my person, my assets, and my medical care, regardless of the power of attorney. They could force me into Serenity Meadows, not as a choice, but as a ward of the state. The core of the document, The evidence they were presenting was centered on the testimony of a Dr. Kenneth Sloan, a geriatric psychiatrist who, I suddenly remembered with a chilling clarity, was Melissa's uncle. He had never examined me. He had based his entire testimony on Daniel and Melissa's detailed log of my supposed erratic behavior, the peony comment, the refusal to sign the checks, the argument over the seating chart. I was trapped. I had protected my finances with a $42 million key, and I had protected my home with the deed transfer, but I had failed to protect my legal personhood. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, less than 48 hours away. I knew that fighting a guardianship petition from within the house would be a losing battle. They would argue my actions, transferring the deed to a caterer and hiding legal documents, were proof of my delusion. I was still vulnerable. I called Robert Vaughn, my voice dangerously calm. Robert, forget the TRO. Forget the escrow. They have filed an emergency competency guardianship petition. Melissa's uncle is the testifying doctor. I need to disappear. Robert understood immediately. If they serve you before the hearing, Eleanor, you are legally obliged to submit to evaluation. We need to move the only asset they can't touch, you. I looked at the beautiful, quiet house. It was safe now, protected by Sophia's future ownership. But I was not. I was the one who had to leave. My final act of self-preservation had to be absolute. I had to disappear from the city, not as a fugitive, but as an independent, legally unserved citizen. I looked down at the tiny key in my hand. The key wasn't to a financial trust. It was the key to my freedom. My greatest fight was not against my children's greed, but against the loss of my own mind. I had to secure my autonomy before Monday. I had less than 48 hours to secure my autonomy before the emergency competency guardianship hearing on Monday. Daniel had delivered the ultimate threat, and the stakes were no longer financial. They were existential. I was not just fighting for my money, I was fighting for my legal right to decide my own fate. I called Robert Vaughn immediately, not from the house line, but from a burner phone I had purchased on my way back from the hotel a week prior. Robert, I have to go to ground. They filed the guardianship petition. Melissa's uncle is the doctor. That's a blatant conflict of interest, Robert growled. But the courts are fast on these emergency filings. If they serve you, Eleanor, you are legally obligated to appear. We need you out of the city now. We need to be able to argue that you were unreachable because they had already established a hostile environment. My plan was simple, the great disappearance. I would not be served. I would be unserved. I took only 3 things: the burner phone, my passport, and the tiny key to the $42 million Manhattan Trust. I left the house unlocked, a deliberate, final act of trust in Sophia. I drove not to the airport, but to a remote, quiet cottage Arthur had owned in the mountains, a property I had ensured was outside the jurisdiction of their current court filings. Robert's team worked through the weekend, frantically trying to dismantle the narrative Daniel and Melissa were building. The courtroom wasn't a physical space yet, it was the legal war waged through paper. We preemptively filed a motion to disqualify Dr. Sloan, citing the family relationship and the complete lack of a physical examination. We attached the audit, the meticulous, clinical log of the nearly $900,000 in financial exploitation, to the countersuit for elder abuse. Robert's strategy was brilliant. We wouldn't argue that I wasn't delusional. We would argue that they had motive to lie because they were already convicted financial abusers. On Sunday night, Robert called me with a victory. The court had dismissed the emergency filing for lack of credible evidence and cited the blatant conflict of interest with Dr. Sloan. They would have to refile for a full hearing, which bought me time. The antagonist's narrative had been formally dismantled. You won this round, Eleanor, Robert said. But the fight isn't over. You need to keep compiling evidence. You need an emotional witness. I knew exactly who I needed. I called Sophia. She answered immediately, her voice weary from cleaning up the wedding aftermath. Eleanor, thank God. The house is clean. The vendors are gone. Daniel and Melissa tried to change the locks, but Robert's security team intervened. They left a box of old tax returns at the gate. Sophia, I need you to do something for me, I said. I need you to tell me what you saw. I need you to confirm the pattern of abuse. Sophia didn't hesitate. She didn't offer pity. She offered the brutal clarity of an outsider. She provided the crucial, objective emotional validation that grounded my pain in reality. "I saw everything, Eleanor," Sophia said quietly. "I saw Daniel stand there while Melissa tore up my work. I saw the look on his face when he knew she stole those coins, and he did nothing. I saw the way they treated you like a fixture that wasn't supposed to move or speak. They didn't see you as a mother, Eleanor. They saw you as a custodial sentence. They were just waiting out your time." She continued, her voice gaining strength. "You didn't go crazy. You woke up. You didn't become difficult. You became clear. You did what any good owner does when they find rats in the foundation. You cleaned the house." The word custodial sentence struck me. That's exactly what I had been, a jailer of my own fortune, serving time for the crime of being wealthy enough to enable their laziness. Sophia's witness statement, her confirmation of the pattern of emotional neglect and financial exploitation, was the final piece of evidence Robert needed. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a profound emotional vindication. My pain was not paranoia, it was proof. I was safe. The guardianship petition had failed. The house was protected by Sophia. The money was protected by Arthur's key. The only thing left was to decide where I would finally live, not as an enabler, not as a victim, but as the owner of my own life. The next morning, I was driving toward the mountain cabin, ready to start the final, decisive chapter of my life. The battle for my autonomy had been won, brick by arduous brick. The mountain air was thin and clean, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of entitlement and deceit I had left behind. I was in Arthur's quiet, remote cottage, safely unserved and shielded from the city court's jurisdiction. The victory over the emergency guardianship petition felt like a profound physical shift. The heavy weight of their control was finally lifted. My final act of separation had begun. I looked down at the tiny key in my hand. It was no longer just the key to the $42 million Manhattan Trust. It was the key to my new life, the ultimate expression of Arthur's belief in my resilience. He had known the house would become a battleground, so he had built me a separate, untouchable future. Robert Vaughn called late that morning. "The judge has issued a formal order, Eleanor. They will have to wait for the full hearing, but we have achieved the goal. The immediate threat to your autonomy is over. They cannot serve you here. The house deed transfer to Sophia is officially recorded. The escrow accounts are safe. Daniel and Melissa are pursuing the only path left to them, a complicated, multi-year civil suit, which we are prepared to defeat with the audit." The legal process was settling, but my emotional journey was reaching its climax. The final decision had been issued not by a judge, but by me. I was reclaiming myself. I walked to the hearth, where I had built a small, welcoming fire. I took the few remaining documents related to Daniel's various failed business ventures, old loan agreements, promissory notes he had signed and failed to honor, all neatly categorized in the audit. I held them over the flames. This was my symbolic act of separation. I wasn't just burning paper. I was burning the enabler. I was burning the decades I spent financially shielding my son from the real-world consequences of his actions. I watched the black smoke curl up the chimney, carrying away the toxic thesis: a mother's duty is to pay for her children's happiness, no matter the cost. My new life didn't need the complexity of that past. It needed simplicity and genuine joy. My new life was structured around a vivid list of simple, genuine joys. Morning clarity. Waking up every day to the silence of the mountains, not the muffled whispers of betrayal. Productive partnership. Working with Sophia, who is now successfully running the historic house as a boutique event venue, while I managed the charitable foundation we had established. We talked daily, not about money, but about real things: menus, garden planning, and her children's homework. Financial freedom. I used the Manhattan Trust to fund two passions: the Arthur Sterling Foundation for Elder Autonomy and an art scholarship in my mother's name. I would be a benefactor, not a bank. Literary comfort. I had a box of Arthur's old books, and I finally had the time to read them, sitting by the fire with a cup of strong coffee, without the anxiety of a doorbell or a demand. The mountain cottage became my sanctuary, not a refuge. I learned to bake sourdough bread, I rediscovered my love for painting the landscapes, and I learned the true meaning of ownership. Owning my own time. I sat by the window, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. My final monologue was whispered into the quiet, crisp air, a legacy not of wealth, but of wisdom. I spent 75 years believing that my love was measured by my sacrifice. I believed that by giving them the house and the fortune, I was buying their respect, their affection, and their presence. I was wrong. My wealth only amplified their lack of character. They thought they could discard me to claim my assets, but they only succeeded in freeing me to claim myself. I looked at the tiny key on the wooden table. The thesis that nearly destroyed me, a mother's duty is to pay for her children's happiness, no matter the cost, is dead. It has been replaced by the one truth that saved me, the antithesis that guides my new life. I did not lose my children. I saved myself and my house from the thieves I raised. And in that act of self-preservation, I finally built the legacy Arthur intended for me, not the inheritance of money, but the inheritance of autonomy. I closed my eyes, feeling a profound, unshakable peace. The structure was gone, but the foundation was unshakable. I was Eleanor Sterling, and my final act was the first day of my life. And before we end today's story, let me leave you with this. Women like her, like all of us, don't become strong by accident. We become strong because life gives us moments that test us, break us, shape us, and force us to choose ourselves. Every betrayal, every manipulation, every moment where someone tries to dim your light is also a moment where you get to decide how brightly you rise afterward. Remember this, you are allowed to protect your peace. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to walk away from people who take more than they give. And most importantly, you are allowed to rebuild your life in a way that honors your worth. Stories like these aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that women can be quiet, but powerful, gentle, but unbreakable, hurt, but never defeated. So, if you needed a sign today, you're stronger than the moment you're in. You're wiser than the people who tried to fool you. And you deserve a life where your peace is non-negotiable. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Voice of Jenna so you never miss the next chapter in our world of twists, lessons, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world to me, and trust me, the stories only get better from here.